You're watching New York One on demand.
I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close-Up. City Controller John Liu's candidacy for mayor has experienced some distractions for the past few weeks, but he's pressing ahead with a host of proposals and plans. He'll tell us about them in just a moment. Times Sunday magazine editor Hugo Lindgren focuses his attention on the cover story. He warned it's heartbreaking. Times theater reporter Patrick Healy discusses the process of refining and redefining a show with three directors of multi-nominated Broadway musicals, Diane Paulus, Mark Brokaw, and Jerry Mitchell. That's the subject of Pat Healy's article in this week's Arts and Leisure section. And of course, we'll convene our Times Reporters Roundtable, but first, City Controller, Democratic mayoral candidate John Liu. There are lots of subjects I want to get to, but first, let me say the 500-pound gorilla in the room, which I just happened to notice on the way in, the conviction of two of your former campaign aides in an illegal campaign finance scheme. Your reaction to it was that this setback has made our campaign more focused, more resolved than ever. But what about the rest of your reaction? People say, are you embarrassed? Are you remorseful? Are you apologetic? Are you furious over their behavior? Are you furious that they got caught? What upset you most about this?
Well, first of all, I'm glad it's now a 500-pound gorilla, because for a long time it was the 800-pound gorilla. Now, today, I mean, look, I'm saddened. I'm saddened for Jenny, and I'm upset. I'm upset at what they put her through. This is a fine young person who has capabilities beyond her years, and she was very hardworking and diligent. And while she may not have been perfect, I think that if they put anybody else through the level of scrutiny that they put her through, or my campaign, then she and my campaign would be head and shoulders above everybody else.
Did she and the campaign do anything wrong as far as you're concerned?
I think that she made some errors in judgment, particularly a call to her ex-boyfriend. Beyond that, and so it was an error in judgment. Was it really a federal offense? I'm doubtful of that. We'll see as the court proceedings continue. It is my understanding that she will be appealing the verdict, and we'll see what happens.
The prosecutor said you must have known what was going on in terms of the campaign financing scheme. You said you did not. You have not been charged at all. But if you didn't know, and this was in fact going on, shouldn't you have known? And let me ask what I think is a fundamental question on the part of most people. If you can't supervise your own campaign treasurer, a young woman in her 20s, how can you oversee a $70 billion budget?
Number one, it is absolutely scurrilous for the prosecutor to have made allegations about me without offering a shred of evidence. To say that I must have known something about it because we had some kind of code language. What was the code language? The code language was, this is Richard's event, and therefore all of the money, I must have known all of the money came from Richard. Sam, if you hold a fundraiser for me, and perhaps I can convince you at some point, my campaign is going to label your event as Sam's event. Mm-hmm. That in no way indicates to anybody that all the money is going to be straw donations coming from you personally. And in fact, I don't think I'm the only campaign that calls an event Sam's event or Richard's event. What else are we going to call it if that's the host's name? So the idea that they would throw this out there is absolutely scurrilous. And you think about it. This is an investigation that's going on 4 years now, including listening in on my phone conversations, my private phone conversations, for a year and a half, which I've been told is unprecedented. A review of untold numbers of documents, interrogation of thousands of my supporters, and all they can do is say in summation that I must have known something about it without offering an iota of evidence. And as far as my responsibility for Jenny, I take full responsibility for what happens in my office and what happens on the campaign. The fact is that Jenny was found guilty of basically this phone call that she made to her ex-boyfriend. I think it was a serious lapse in judgment on her part. Federal offense, as I said before, that's very questionable. So let's get to the bottom of all this. I want them to finish doing whatever they can. If they're done, say so. But don't leave this hanging in there like this. This is not due process.
Let's turn to the other gorillas then. Housing, the homeless. So you say two things should be done there: more transparency in citing housing, shelters, and otherwise. Also, a new voucher program that would, in effect, replace the Advantage program that was scrapped first by the state and second by the city. Why would those work better than what we have now?
I think it's universally accepted that the Bloomberg administration's housing policy and homeless policy has been a failure. I mean, the mayor talked about eradicating homelessness, and just not too long ago said that there were no people living on the streets of New York City, which is actually evidence of being out of touch with reality. Forget about all that. I just want to go focus on how we move forward. The reality is that right now the Department of Homeless Services, they have basically no procedure in place in terms of how to site shelters. Everything is done on an emergency ad hoc basis, thus bypassing all kinds of community review and input.
But if you had that review, would anything get built?
Well, listen, it's part of the law. It's part of the law, and so they need to follow these kinds of procedures. It is unfair to both communities where these shelters get sited in, as well as unfair to the homeless that have to go through these kinds of conditions. So what I proposed is an expansion of the rental voucher system. This is something that actually will save taxpayers money, because we are still spending, believe it or not, about $3,000 a month on average housing homeless people in apartments. Now, I'm not saying that we can't do any more of it. I think we still have a responsibility, particularly to homeless families with children. But $3,000 a month
but
is
the
exorbitant.
Advantage program, the mayor said, drew more homeless. It was sort of what Ed Koch said about building housing for the homeless, build it and they will come. If you have a voucher program, won't you attract more homeless or not?
It's all about giving families a place to stay, but not just ending our policies there. We have to have a holistic set of economic development policies. I think we have a tremendous amount of potential to create jobs in the coming years. I've already done so with my capital acceleration plan, where we draw upon the city's capital pipeline and taking advantage of low interest rates today, bringing those projects earlier in the timetable so we can put people to work, get those schools and parks up online quicker than possible before, and save money for the taxpayers in the long run.
Quickly, I want to talk about the budget, too. You have a people's budget online at your website. The mayor's budget you called a holding pattern budget based on unwarranted assumptions. Don't you worry that if you get elected mayor, you will inherit all of these budget problems?
I worry about the hole that Mayor Bloomberg's administration is leaving taxpayers in by the end of this year. Huge amounts of bills that haven't been recognized and certainly not paid. So whoever the next mayor is going to have to grapple with these huge problems. I've got a set of solutions in place. The people's budget is a review that my office has conducted top to bottom of this current budget. Instead of having people focus on this ridiculous budget dance that focuses on less than 0.5% of the city's budget, we've looked at the entire budget, identified $15 billion over the next 4 years of needs that should be reflected in the city budget. For example, baselining library service and after-school programs, and an accompanying $15 billion of revenues to pay for that.
We'll invite you back to talk more about that in greater detail as the campaign progresses.
Peoplesbudgetnyc.com. Come in and offer your input.
Okay, thanks to Controller John Liu, and when we return, Times Sunday Magazine editor Hugo Lindgren. Welcome back to the New York Times Close-Up. Joining us now, Hugo Lindgren, editor of the Sunday Times Magazine. The cover article by John Liu, Who Would Kill a Monk Seal? It's already provoked controversy and finger-pointing. Who would kill a monk seal, Hugo?
Well, John actually gets to the bottom of it. You meet one of the killers in the story. But really what the story is about the conflict in Hawaii between native islanders who feel like the federal government sort of coming in there and mandating how they should live, and the preservationists or the endangered species preservationists who are working hard and spending quite a bit of money to preserve this endangered animal.
How does a story like this come to you, and why does it get on the cover of the magazine?
Well, it's a good question. I think that John Liu is one of our sort of best contributing writers. He's really an intrepid journalist. This is his area. He's
people and animals.
People and animals, exactly. And he did this great story for us during the Republican convention about a monkey that was loose in Tampa Bay, and it was a great, had a sort of metaphoric, symbolic kind of play with what was going on with the conventions, and so we've been discussing a number of different stories with us, and he said, there's these weird things happening around the country, not just in Hawaii, but with other species and in other parts of the country where
there's sort of a backlash.
Animals were turning up dead. There's several bald eagles that had been killed in a couple of places, some brown pelicans. There are a number of different cases, and he said, would you like to look into this? It's not. It's not just about sort of endangered species. It's a larger conflict between government and local communities.
And also about human nature.
And about human nature as well. I mean, it's interesting. This campaign to save the monk seals is a 50-year program that's going to cost something close to $400 million, which may well be money well spent. But if you go into these communities and you talk to some of these people, they're looking at things that they don't understand. They're looking at resources put behind a cause that they're not sure they believe in. It's a conflict.
One of the things I found fascinating, and it's on NYTimes.com, is on the blog, is how you pick the cover. Yeah. The goal in how picking the cover was how do you handle a subject matter that is clearly sensitive without sensationalizing it, without being too graphic. What went into that decision making?
Well, what was great is that my design department came up with a whole series of options, which we show on our blog, and one of them had quite a bit of blood on it, and it made me a little queasy. Others were
especially on a Sunday morning.
Well, that's it. Is that you want to be understanding of where the magazine meets people in their lives, and you want to be able to sort of get the intensity of their curiosity, but you don't want to gross them out. So we looked for something that had a combination of that was graphic and strong, but that wasn't that wasn't gross.
You have an article in this week's Sunday Times Magazine too, "The Plot Against Rock." How do you decide what to write about?
Well, that was just we needed.
Or does someone assign it to you?
Well, I talk about it with my staff. I wanted to write. We needed a short story, so I said, this rock band that I really like, they're called Orchestral Maneuvers in the Dark, and they have this sort of unlikely career. They've been around since the late 70s, and I went and hung out with them and told us their story. And it's it's not a big feature compared to John's cover story. It's really just a trifling. But one of the keys, one of the things we try to do with the magazine is offer a lot of different things and a lot of unexpected things, so that when you open your Sunday newspaper and you get to it, you don't know exactly what's coming, and that there's a lot of variety.
When I worked in the Week in Review section, what is now the Sunday Review, one of the challenges I always found was that the paper, the front page of the paper in particular, was becoming more and more featurey, more and more interpretive, more analytical. Do you find that the rest of the paper is becoming more magazine-y, and that sort of raises the threshold for you?
Sam, I think that's a really good way to put it. That's exactly how we feel. And it's a challenge. It means that, we need to go seek out writers farther afield, different kinds of storytelling. And I think John Liu is a good example of someone who has talents and gifts that we don't necessarily have with other writers at the New York Times. But we do have a lot of great sort of narrative storytellers at the paper, at the magazine, and in all the different sections. So, it really does raise the bar in terms of what we need to do at the magazine. And I think it's great. I think the quality of writing in the New York Times has never been higher. Mm-hmm. And, that's a really exciting thing. And I think that people will read now, a story on the front page of the New York Times, and it's not just sort of straight news. There's all kinds of different sort of journalism going on, and I think that's terrific most of all, it's terrific for our readers.
Hugo, can you explain briefly for our viewers what the difference is between what goes in T magazine and what goes in the Sunday Times magazine?
Sure.
Per se?
T is our monthly sort of style magazine, and it's a big glossy sort of luxury magazine, and I think they will focus more on style, more on sort of the arts and design. We still do a lot of that. We have a big feature on an artist named Paul McCarthy in this issue, but he's the kind of artist, if you read the story, that's not going to be in T magazine. He's a very sort of he's really pushing the levels, pushing at the sort of the edges of kind of sort of what people find acceptable. It's really, it's pretty grueling stuff. We present him in a way that I don't think will shock people in the magazine, but if you experience some of his work, you may well be shocked. So
thank you so much for joining us. Hugo Lindgren, editor of the Sunday Times Magazine. You can read the entire articles, of course, in the magazine and at nytimes.com. You'll find the accompanying videos as well. And when we return, what it takes to create magic on Broadway. Times Theater reporter Pat Healy and I talk with 3 directors of multi-Tony-nominated musicals.
I wanted to ring off the bells and fling up my arms and to sing out the news. I have found love.
Welcome back to the New York Times Close-Up. How do you assess what works in the theater and what doesn't? What part does audience reaction play, especially when you're in previews and with a big-budget musical? Times Theater reporter Pat Healy talked with a host of the principals involved with the Tony-nominated musicals, Matilda, Pippin, Cinderella, Kinky Boots, his story in the Sunday Times Arts and Leisure section. And joining Pat Healy and myself, Diane Paulus, the director of Pippin, Mark Brokaw, the director of Rodgers and Hammerstein's Cinderella, and Jerry Mitchell, the director of Kinky Boots. Pat, you wrote that no period is more important in the theater than previews. Why is that?
Because shows are coming out of the rehearsal room and they're going into the theater and then before a live audience. And while a show may be one thing and a very exciting thing in the rehearsal room and in a dress rehearsal before friends, when it gets in front of a live audience, what I learned from these directors and others reporting the show is that reporting the story is that you start learning new things about your show. You start learning things about the rhythm and the pacing of the show for some new scripts, dialogue that's working, that's telling the story really clearly, dialogue that maybe could be sharper or land moments better. So once you get into those first early previews, it's a time that I found that a great deal of additional work goes on to figure out, okay, where can we take the show from here to here, and how do we go about doing that?
These are 3 shows that evolved from whatever they started out in previews into spectacular hits. Diane, how did Pippin change over that period?
We integrated several new elements into our show. It originated up at Boston at the American Repertory Theater, and for instance, we integrated real fire into our production, and that's something you actually can't even test out in a rehearsal hall. So we were lighting these torches for the first time in the tech and putting them into the show, and you really can't ever understand what that will feel like in the flow. I think it's feeling the energy of the audience and the flow. So elements like fire, production numbers. I mean, when you craft a new production number, which we actually tweaked all the previews, I'm sure we've all done that. You also have limited rehearsal when you're in previews, so you're rehearsing a little bit in the afternoon, and then you're actually using the performance at night to test an idea, and then you're evaluating it and going back into the rehearsal the next day to continue to fix it. So the performance has become like ongoing rehearsal in previews.
Mark and Jerry, what about you in Cinderella and in Kinky Boots? How much changed from the first preview to opening night or to today?
You know, actually with Cinderella it was quite a remarkable amount. We ended up cutting 25 minutes from the first preview to opening night and did a lot of musical adjustment also. Much more than I would have thought we were going to do. You know, with starting out, it always seems to be a little more than you think.
I mean, because you see something and say, my God, this doesn't work, or the way the audience reacts? Or...
You know, you have a hunch going in about what you think is working and what you think isn't, and the audience tells you, then it confirms what your hunch or not. And with us, it was about focusing the story, about who really needed to be at the center, what relationships needed to be at the center, and what was extra, what was fat. And it wasn't just cutting, it was a lot of rewriting. It was a tremendous amount of new material every day, and the cast, they were real aces about it all. I couldn't believe the amount of material we were throwing at them every day. It was really unending, and all the new dancing.
That's hard work. They have to unlearn and learn.
Yeah, but you know, if it's better at night, it's easier because they know it's better, so they're more willing to do it. But it was a very exciting time because the show really transformed and became itself over the period of previews.
And sometimes with these newer shows too, you have sometimes a line of dialogue that an actor is getting at maybe 3 p.m. that's going in for the first time in that show, right? With Jerry, too, with the choreography, Kinky Boots has some wonderful sort of large cast ensemble production.
Yes,
numbers.
well, we had the luxury of being out of town first, where we did a great deal of the work, although I continued to tweak the show once I got to New York. I think going out of town with a new musical is, you know, you just can't do a new musical without going out of town, because you get you get everything twice. You get 2 preview periods, you get 2 tech periods, you just get more time.
And it costs more.
It does cost more, but I think if the investment is, I think it's worth the investment. Ultimately, with Kinky Boots, it couldn't have gone better.
How do you know when the preview period should end? Obviously, with Spider-Man, it seemed to go on indefinitely. But in your shows, there's an opening night scheduled. But how do you know everything is going to work within that period?
You've got your time clock.
Nothing
and
like
that's-
a deadline,
It's
a
like
given before you
It's
start.
based
You know
on
what it
dollars.
is.
It's based on dollars, and most shows in general have a 4-week preview period, and then they open. It doesn't change much unless there's a real problem, and they have the money to back it to fix the problems.
And it's like you're running a race, so you're in training, and as the director, you're guiding the timing.
Yeah.
And it's accelerating, and the cast is mentally
You're guiding the
moving
timing,
towards that
the
opening.
energy,
The energy is
focus,
getting
all of it.
more and more excited. So when a process goes well, you're ready to open. It's like, enough with the previews. Let's open the show. You know, you're ready to do it.
When you have that preview period and you have like 3 hours, 4 hours of rehearsal and then a performance that night, how do you tell sort of how much you can get done in like a 4-hour rehearsal period to get it ready to put into the show that night? Or is it just, let's do the best we can? And, I don't know.
I feel like you know, or you just learn what is going to take the time. It's about prioritizing also on that day. What you have that list of what you're going to do, and there's that thing that you think is so important, but it keeps getting shoved down every day because there are 3 other things that become much more important than that. And
Dialogue becomes a very simple thing to change. Anything that is musicalized, that has cueing, technical cueing, I mean scenery moving, lights changing, that's where you need more time. Those things you're lucky if you can get 4 done a day.
Right.
And you often don't have your orchestra with you.
Right.
So you're doing it with a rehearsal
Then you
pianist,
do a
and
follow-up
then
call
there's a
with the
continuity call with the orchestra
Jerry,
right before.
Pat wrote in his piece that you went to Cyndi Lauper and said, I need a new hit, not just a song, but a hit song. We got to make Charlie more lovable. Does she come up with one just like that?
Well, I was speaking to her in what I thought at that time might be her language. She said, what kind of song do you want? And I said, I want a hit. I said, you write hits? Write me a hit. Write me a song that will make me fall in love with the character, because he didn't have that in Chicago. And it became apparent when we were in front of the audience that they liked the song, but they weren't falling in love with Charlie
How can
Price.
you tell?
Oh, I can tell.
I was an audience member in
can tell.
Chicago and heard the first song
All you
and
have
then
to
heard the
do-
new song, and it is night and day, Sam. It's really
All
interesting.
you have to do is pay attention to the audience.
Well, Diane did this too with Pippin in the second act in Cambridge. It's a strong second act, and there's a beautiful sort of love story between Pippin and a character named Catherine. But there were also you had so many circus elements and Fosse sort of style dancing in the first act, and there just ended up being a little bit less of it in the second act in Cambridge. But then when you got to New York, it really felt sort of fully rounded.
You have a second chance. It's like
Yeah.
a second chance to go back
to
and
do it all again.
look at your show in a different way.
We'll have a second chance. We'll be back right after these messages.
You'll never again be subject to abuse, for you're a next caboose. She'll call a truce, Bruce. With every swallow you are tightening the noose. We never thought it was possible, but it
Welcome back to the New York Times Close-Up, and my Times colleague, theater reporter Patrick Healy, the directors Diane Paulus of Pippin, Mark Brokaw of Rodgers and Hammerstein's Cinderella, Jerry Mitchell of Kinky Boots. Each show nominated for many Tony Awards. Let me ask you, Diane, you and Mark both were dealing with revivals, musical revivals. How did the changing mores, the changing culture, the changing technology affect what you were going to do?
Actually, for me, I really wanted to create a production of Pippin that was extremely visceral and non-technological. And that's what I remembered being a kid growing up in New York City, seeing the original Pippin, was that shocking, physical, seductive, grounded, bodies in space. You know,
God, it sounds great.
a little circus thrown in, but no, you know, the technology of course affects, because you can have the orchestra sound more lush with less instruments. I mean, there's definite technological touches and lights and things, but it's not always the case that technology is what you want the audience to perceive.
And Mark, did you have to bring it up to date in any way?
You know, there was a little bit of how to present Cinderella now. And traditionally, sometimes she's a little more of a passive character. And I think Doug Bean was really interested in how to make it, rather than this woman who is rescued by a man, how does this meeting of a man and a woman, how do they rescue each other?
And you kept the slipper.
Oh yeah, we kept the slipper. A few different things happened with it along the way than normal.
Yeah.
But you know, about technology also, I think the same was true with Cinderella. You know, doing it now, I think we would have had the opportunity to, there's a lot of magic and a lot of transformations that happen. And I think one of the earliest discussions we had, designers and myself, was how do we want to do that? Do we want it to be technological, or do we want it to be theater magic? And I think the biggest decision and the most important one we made early on was we want it to be theater magic. You know, we want it to happen right in front of your eyes. And not have it be machine-oriented and technology-driven.
All three of these shows have sort of key relationships, too, old-fashioned relationships at the heart of them. Cinderella and the Prince, two main characters, Charlie and Lola in Kinky Boots, and then Pippin, who relates to several characters along the way. I was sort of curious during previews, during Out of Town, to what extent there was so much else going on in your shows. Were there moments where you said, okay, we need to sort of step back and just make sure we're keeping the focus on those sort of core relationships so they don't get swamped by everything else?
Well, I sort of have the luxury of being able to work very closely with my choreographer.
You are the choreographer.
Yes.
Okay.
So I think these guys have another challenge that I didn't have, which was the collaboration between a director and choreographer. Because in a musical, that relationship has to be seamless, and often is a huge telling point about how a musical will be interpreted and how it will be brought to life. And so I found that my work, that work that you're talking about, actually started for me 6 months out as I was creating the show with Harvey and Cindy, knowing where it would dance, knowing where it wouldn't dance, most importantly, and where the characters would step to the front and tell their story simply in a light.
Let me ask you a question that Patrick undoubtedly knows the answer to. I don't. The show opens. What does the director do next? Is your job over?
The job is never over. Oh my gosh. You know, you have been sitting at your theater, right? Every single performance for up to 4 weeks of preview. So usually after opening, you don't go for a few days. Yes?
Yes.
Ladies? Okay.
Yeah.
You take a break really to like cleanse your eyes and get a break. But then you want to be back. You want to be back. Then the show moves into its next phase of life, which is running the show. You have understudies and swings to train. You're looking how your cast is performing in a longer-term running mode.
Public performances, presentations, television, precedents that you have to somehow make work in new environments, but tell the story that you're trying to tell every night on stage. Can't always take your costumes, can't always take your sets. How do you get the word out of what it is you're doing in the theater when you're not in the theater?
And for the nights you're not there, there's a usual production stage manager or stage manager taking notes on the show. And do those get sent to you every night so you sort of know?
Yes.
I actually have an associate director and choreographer on the show who do that for me.
And let me ask perhaps a more sensitive question. The critics, do you ever take their advice? Do you ever say, you know, that guy, that woman is right?
I listen. If we're out of town, listen, I think critics in New York should come on the first preview.
Really?
Yes, and write their reviews so we can use it to make the show better by the time we open. Because once the review comes out, there is nothing you can do. And when we're out of town in Chicago,
as long as they come and review it again, when it actually opens.
Sure, if they want, they can review it as many times as they want. But it's not helpful after the opening, unfortunately, in New York City. Not to us, not to the team that is trying to make a successful show.
Thanks to Times Theater reporter Patrick Healy, to Diane Paulus, the director of Pippin, Mark Brokaw, director of Rodgers and Hammerstein's Cinderella, Jerry Mitchell, director of Kinky Boots. Congratulations to all of you, and the Times' Reporters Roundtable convenes right after these messages. Welcome back to the New York Times Close-Up. What kind of week has it been? Not a good one for former Queens State Senator Shirley Huntley. She joined a group of legislators found guilty of crimes, let's say greed. Republican mayoral candidate Joe Loda called Port Authority police mall cops. Needless to say, he apologized for that intemperate remark. And Willie Sutton could have foreseen this, one of the largest bank heists in history, without a note to a teller or even a weapon. Joining me to discuss these stories and more, my New York Times colleagues, writer-at-large Clyde Haberman, editorial board member Eleanor Randolph, Albany Bureau reporter Thomas Kaplan, and we welcome back Metro reporter Javier Hernandez. Tom, a crazy week for you in Albany. It seems like the indicted and the under investigation could establish their own caucus.
It has reached a sort of surreal point at the Capitol now, and we have at least a half dozen members of the New York State Senate under an active criminal investigation by the feds, 2 sitting members under indictment, and more possibly to come, given that we've now had, in the past year or so, 1 assembly member and 1 state senator recording their colleagues.
At the rate at which they're ratting out each other, I mean, you know, there'll be a majority soon.
Over the past 7 years, 32 state office holders have been caught up in scandals. I mean, it's reached it's hard to wrap your head around that number.
Do we know how that compares to the population at large? This is 32 out of...
too many.
Yes, too many. What is going on up there?
Well, you know what? I think one of the things, the really important things that's going on is that the feds have increasingly gotten involved in figuring out how these people are breaking the law. NYPIRG, the New York Public Interest Research Group, put out a report this past week that showed that there are more than 100,000 violations of the campaign elections law that the Board of Elections has done nothing about. And that's just one area and one set of laws.
Now, these technical things or criminal things?
I think most of them are technical, but I can't be sure because we haven't gone through all of them yet. But 100,000, that's a lot, and that's in the last 2 years. So you know what, the legislature and Governor Cuomo set up this ethics commission that was going to look at all this stuff. But so far, it has really been the FBI that's done the hard work. And
now the Ethics Commission is trying to redact, or the legislative leadership is trying to redact any reference to the legislative leaders and their role in the Vito Lopez affair.
Right. I mean, the big thing Governor Cuomo pushed for 2 years ago was to set up a new quasi-independent ethics commission. It is off the ground. Its first big case was Vito Lopez, and already we're seeing sort of it's so complicated how it was set up. The Legislative Ethics Commission is trying to basically get references to Speaker Silver out of the report that we have still not seen yet on Vito Lopez. So it's another complicated, just things that don't, instill confidence in the public that these mechanisms actually will do anything to, bring some sunlight to what is increasingly, a laughing stock again, I think.
In the meantime, Vito Lopez is supposed to be running for city council. And so, you've got this bounce from one legislative body to another. The State Ethics Commission is supposed to come out with a report, we think, on May 21st. So, put that on your calendar and wait for it.
Clyde?
Even though I did say on the show a few weeks ago that it probably wouldn't be a bad thing if they all wore wires in one another, you do have
They'd
to
electrocute each other.
You have to wonder, though, are some people being unfairly tarred? Now, the Huntley wire, I mean, she's sort of like one of the characters out of The Sopranos. There are a bunch of people who've named there. Eric Adams, for example, who's running for Brooklyn Borough President, and a few others.
And Eric Schneiderman.
And she names Eric Schneiderman, but doesn't offer, so far as we know, a shred of evidence of what she's talking about. But these are people who are potentially tainted in the eyes of many people, and we have no idea if they've done anything wrong, just simply that they talked into Shirley Huntley's microphone.
The feds used to call it puffing, which I guess relates to pipe dream or some other metaphor like that. Speaking of which, Avi, you've been covering the mayoral campaign race, and one of the forums, it's hard to imagine any questions left unasked, but the candidates were asked where they used to live, and that kind of rattled them a little bit, you pointed out.
Yeah, for a lot of them, they're trying to portray themselves as kind of these people, men and women of the people, and to have them directly asked about how much they paid in rent the last time was very enlightening. Most of them lived in Park Slope, and many of them, Bill de Blasio, for instance, misremembered his own rent, which many people kind of grumbled about. He thought he had paid $1,800 back in the 90s. He actually only paid $1,200 or something like that, as his spokesman
That's a better mistake than the other way around.
Right, but as his campaign was very quick to point out. So, you know, it's a race each week, I think, for each of them to kind of connect with voters. De Blasio especially seems to be trying to portray himself as somebody who understands parents, who understands minority communities in Brooklyn and Queens. And that's a constant kind of tension between the candidates.
That question from Ken Sherrill, the former Hunter professor. Clint?
Some of these forums might strike some observers as being a little bit odd, like the animal rights one, but it was pointed out to me, you know, we're not going to have a huge turnout probably in the primaries. I may be wrong on this, but if the turnout is indeed kind of small, whether you make it into the runoff or not may be decided by a couple of hundred votes. So you have some people who on certain issues, they're going to vote only on that issue. If somebody comes out and says, I don't give a damn about the horses in Central Park and being on Central Park South, well, you might have lost 200 voters right there who are going to vote solely on that issue.
And 4 legs and 2 legs that would give you 2 legs
good,
up,
2 legs
I guess.
bad, you know, as from the old Animal Farm.
Yes.
But anyway.
Do you think they'd really care about the candidate that gave mouth-to-mouth resuscitation to his family cat?
Well, especially when it didn't work.
It didn't work.
We'll be back after these messages. Welcome back to the New York Times Close-Up and to my Times colleagues, Clyde Haberman, Eleanor Randolph, Thomas Kaplan, and Javier Hernandez. Tom, when Shirley Huntley was sentenced, Judge Jack Weinstein said there adequate safeguards at the state and local level would be more appropriate deterrents than the blunt instrument of criminal prosecution. What about those safeguards? Are we going to see any more of them enacted as a result of all of this?
It's hard to say. I mean, the governor has put out a sort of a slew of proposals, but a lot of them, I think some government watchdog groups characterize as sort of small bore. I mean, not anything sweeping, not public campaign financing, for instance. Making things that are illegal just more illegal, harsher sentences, things like that. So he is saying, yes, you know, he will get something done, and if not, he will appoint a commission to investigate the legislature. But so far, the legislature has not been receptive. It's interesting, actually, given just how many scandals in a row that there's not more outrage from lawmakers. There should be some honest ones, and you would think you'd have more.
Well, why is that?
I think
they certainly can't be worried about alienating their colleagues.
No, but I think there's some thought that as an institution, the legislature does not like ceding power or ceding, you know, letting other people investigate them. And I think that's partly why they're not eager, for instance, for the Board of Elections to have, you know, more rigorous enforcement.
I'm going to get that gorilla back, Eleanor.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Well, you know, the thing is, I think one of the things they're avoiding at all cost is the possibility of competition. And the public financing, which is the really hard nut to crack up there, they are now doing almost anything they can to undermine that as a possibility. But it is the one way. I mean, what Tom and I have seen is that most of these people are elected for life. In fact, if they're indicted or convicted, that's one of the few ways you can get them out of office.
Well, when the governor capitulated on redistricting last year, didn't we get a promise, or didn't some civic groups get a promise that he was going to come forward, come ahead on campaign financing?
Yes. Yes, they did. Well, he has put out a proposal. We haven't seen the details of it, I think, but he's put out a proposal for public financing. But the question is how much he's fighting for it. You know, he's got plenty of clout. Although he's gone around saying, "Oh, I don't think the legislature will do this. I don't think they'll go along with this." Well, you know, he and Shelley Silver, especially. Shelley Silver the Assembly just enacted a public financing bill. And so he and Shelley Silver can really work on the Republicans and the independent Democrats and whoever can still vote in the state Senate to get some kind of public financing system through.
Tom, you and Jim McKinley covered a story in Albany the other day that had a wonderful lead to it. Something was missing at a public hearing held by the state Senate on Tuesday to examine New York City's campaign finance system. The public. What happened?
Well, it was simple as that. The Republicans who have partial control of the state Senate, they really do not like public financing. So they decided they would hold a hearing to bring attention to what they say are the abuses in the New York City public financing system. This was all just kind of to create a headline showing they don't like public financing. But they didn't totally think this through. I think advocates for public financing came to the Capitol to protest.
The operative word being think.
Yeah. They would not let them in. They, for a time, would not let reporters into the hearing room. Eventually, the protesters discovered an open window and went outside the Capitol to the window to protest. It was a very bad scene and resulted in stories like that, which did not help their cause, I think it's fair to say.
Clyde?
The whole transparency thing is unbelievable. We had the equivalent in the city this week. Jim Dwyer, our colleague, had a terrific column this week that was both very amusing and infuriating at the same time, sort of a perfect column, and dealt with all those emails involving Kathy Black and, as Jim said, sort of trying to rope in the guest list for Studio 54 circa 1978 as on the education policy, and to simply ask the city's law department under Michael Cardozo, how much have you spent of city taxpayer money on fighting these kinds of freedom of information requests? They said, file a freedom of information request. Am I nuts? I know I've said this before, but is not every single dime that is taxpayer money spent should just be out there as information for the people who are paying this?
Well, also I had a story earlier in the week saying that while nobody wants to encourage frivolous lawsuits, if you sue the city because of something that has been done wrong in the school system, the suit will eventually get thrown out because you've sued the wrong person. You're supposed to sue the Board of Education as if anyone knew the Board of Education still existed. Javi, the candidates are going to be filing financial statements again soon. Is there any sense as to what we should be looking for, obviously, other than who's raised the most money in this period of time?
I would look very closely at Bill Thompson's campaign. I think he's brought in a lot of high-profile establishment endorsements, as well as Mayoral Tisch, the powerful state board regent. And she supposedly has been working behind the scenes to broaden his coalition. You know, he's been very popular among a lot of African-American and Latino voters. Now they sort of have their sights aimed at some deeper pockets in Manhattan boardrooms and that kind of thing.
And endorsed by Dick Ravitch this past week, too.
Yeah.
Thanks to my New York Times colleagues, Clyde Haberman, Eleanor Randolph, Thomas Kaplan, and Javier Hernandez for joining us. And we'll take a look at the headlines from Sunday's Times right after this. We'll be back next Saturday night at 10 and Sunday morning at 10. You can learn who our guests are in advance by logging on either to NY1.com or NYTimes.com, the New York region page. For the New York Times and New York One News, I'm Sam Roberts.